The rain fell like bullets against the windows of Southwick House. Inside the converted manor that served as Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Bernard Montgomery stood alone before a wall of maps, his famous beret crushed in his white-knuckled grip. Outside, the English Channel had become a monster, waves reaching 15 feet, winds howling at 40 knots. Somewhere in that chaos, 5,000 ships waited in harbors across southern England. 156,000 men sat in cramped transport vessels, many already seasick, all of them waiting for orders that might never come. The invasion of Normandy was supposed to begin 12 hours ago. Now it existed only as red pins on Montgomery's maps and prayers whispered in 1,000 different languages. Montgomery traced his finger along the Norman coastline. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Each one represented months of planning, intelligence gathering, and rehearsal. He knew the position of every German machine gun nest, every concrete bunker, every minefield. He had studied Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's defensive philosophy until he could predict his old enemy's thoughts. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, Hitler's supposedly impenetrable fortress, and Montgomery had found its weaknesses, but he could not command the weather. The door opened behind him. Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, entered with rain still dripping from his coat. His face told Montgomery everything before he spoke a word. The storm would not break. The low-pressure system spinning over the Atlantic showed no signs of weakening. Landing craft would capsize in these seas. Paratroopers dropped from aircraft would scatter across 50 miles of countryside. The carefully coordinated assault would become chaos before a single soldier touched French soil. Montgomery dismissed Stagg with a curt nod and turned back to his maps. He thought of the men trapped on those ships. The 3rd Infantry Division. The 50th Northumbrian. The 6th Airborne. Young men from Manchester and Glasgow and Cardiff, from farms in Yorkshire and factories in Birmingham. They had trained for 2 years for this moment. They had survived the Blitz, the rationing, the grinding fear of a German invasion that never came. Now they sat in metal hulls, vomiting into buckets, wondering if they would ever see home again. Every hour of delay ate at their courage like acid. Admiral Bertram Ramsay arrived next, his naval uniform immaculate despite the weather. He commanded Operation Neptune, the naval component of the invasion, and his calm demeanor masked a deep concern. The tide tables dictated everything. The assault required low tide to expose Rommel's beach obstacles, followed by rising water to float landing craft over the obstacles on subsequent waves. Only 3 days in June offered the right combination of tide and moonlight for the airborne operations. June 5th was already lost. June 6th looked impossible. If they waited until June 19th, the secret could not hold. German intelligence would discover the fleet. Rommel would reinforce Normandy with panzer divisions currently held in reserve near Calais. The war might stretch into 1946. Millions more would die. Montgomery walked to the window. Lightning flickered over the invisible channel. He thought of Rommel, probably sleeping peacefully at his home in Hurlingen, Germany. Intelligence reports confirmed the field marshal had left France to celebrate his wife's birthday, confident that no invasion could come in such weather. The element of surprise, the one advantage the Allies possessed, still held, but for how long? Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory joined the gathering, his expression grave. He commanded the air forces tasked with dropping 13,000 paratroopers behind German lines before dawn. Without clear skies, transport aircraft could not navigate accurately. Pathfinders could not mark drop zones. The 6th Airborne Division might land in the English Channel instead of the Orne River bridges. Leigh-Mallory had calculated 70% casualties if the drops proceeded in poor visibility. 70%. Nearly 10,000 young men, the weight of those numbers pressed on Montgomery's chest like a physical force. He had led men in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. He had ordered attacks knowing some would die. But this was different. This was the liberation of Europe. This was the beginning of the end, or the end of everything. At 9:30, Stagg returned. His face had changed. Something like hope flickered in his exhausted eyes. The meteorological data showed a possibility, thin, fragile, but real. A ridge of high pressure might push the storm system aside. A window of acceptable weather could open on the morning of June 6, 36 hours of calmer seas and broken clouds. That it was not ideal. It was not what they had planned. But it might be enough. Montgomery felt his heart quicken. He crushed his beret tighter in his fist and turned to face his fellow commanders. The decision ultimately belonged to General Eisenhower, the supreme commander. But Montgomery knew what he would say when asked. The men were ready. The plan was ready. The world was waiting. They would go. At 4:15 in the morning on June 5, 1944, the most powerful men in the Allied war machine gathered in the library of Southwick House while thunder shook the ancient walls. Candles flickered on the mantelpiece. The power had failed twice already. Cold coffee sat forgotten in china cups. Outside, the storm raged on, mocking everything they had built over 2 years of relentless preparation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood at the center of the room, his face carved with exhaustion. As Supreme Commander, the final decision rested entirely on his shoulders. In his pocket, folded and ready, was a handwritten note accepting full responsibility for failure. If the invasion collapsed, if the beaches became graveyards, if the German panzers pushed the Allies back into the sea, he would take the blame alone. Group Captain Stagg presented his forecast one final time. The weather models showed a narrow window opening in approximately 30 hours. The storm would weaken. Cloud cover would thin enough for bombers to operate, though accuracy would suffer. The channel would calm to rough but manageable seas. The window would last perhaps 36 hours before the next storm system arrived. That it was not the perfect conditions they had prayed for. But perfect conditions did not exist in war. Eisenhower pulled each commander in turn. Montgomery spoke first, his voice sharp and certain. His ground forces were ready. His men had trained for every scenario, including poor weather. Delay would destroy their fighting spirit more surely than German bullets. Admiral Ramsey nodded slowly. The Navy could manage the crossing, though losses would be higher than planned. Some landing craft would capsize. Some men would drown before reaching the beach. But the fleet would deliver its cargo to Normandy. Air Marshal Lee Mallory remained troubled. The paratroopers of the 6th Airborne and American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions faced the greatest risk. Night drops into hostile territory required precise navigation. Scattered landings meant scattered forces, easy prey for German counterattacks. He could not guarantee the airborne operation would succeed, but he could not guarantee waiting would improve their chances either. General Frederick Morgan watched from the corner of the room, saying nothing. He had designed the original invasion plan, Operation Overlord, before Montgomery arrived to refine it. Years of work, thousands of hours of calculation, every lesson learned from the disastrous Dieppe raid of 1942. He remembered the young officers who had died testing early landing craft. The secrets they had buried. The sacrifices already made to reach this moment. All of it led here. To this room. To this storm. To this choice. Eisenhower walked to the rain-streaked window. The weight of 156,000 lives pressed against his spine. Beyond the glass lay darkness and wind and an enemy waiting behind concrete walls and minefields. Rommel had promised Hitler that the first 24 hours would decide everything. If the Allies could be stopped on the beaches, the invasion would fail. If they established a foothold, the war would turn. 24 hours to change history. Eisenhower thought of the young paratroopers at this moment strapping on their equipment, blackening their faces, writing letters to sweethearts they might never see again. He thought of the sailors checking engines and the pilots reviewing flight plans. They were ready. They had been ready for months. What right did he have to make them wait longer? The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, Eisenhower turned from the window. His voice came out quiet, almost casual, as if he were discussing the weather itself rather than the fate of nations. Okay. We'll go. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Staff officers rushed to telephones. Coded messages began flowing to every ship, every airfield, every command post across southern England. The invasion was set for the morning of June 6, 1944. Hour for the beach landings, 6:30 a.m. The airborne drops would begin shortly after midnight. Montgomery caught Morgan's eye across the crowded library. The architect and the warrior. Two men who had given everything to this moment. Morgan offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Whatever happened next, they had done their duty, but before either could speak, an aide rushed through the door, his face pale. Urgent intelligence from Bletchley Park. German Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted approaching the channel earlier that night. They had turned back due to the storm, but if the weather cleared too soon, if German pilots discovered the fleet before dawn on June 6. The element of surprise was everything. Without it, Rommel's panzers would reach the beaches before the Allies could establish defensive positions. The slaughter would be absolute. Montgomery straightened his shoulders and reached for his beret. There was nothing more to do but trust the plan, trust the men, and trust that fortune favored the bold. The longest day in human history was about to begin. The first C-47 Dakota transport lifted off from RAF Harwell at 11:03 p.m. on June 5, 1944. Within the hour, over 800 aircraft would fill the skies above southern England, carrying 13,000 paratroopers toward the dark coastline of France. The storm had broken just as Stagg predicted. Patches of stars appeared between racing clouds. The channel still churned with whitecaps, but the worst had passed. General Miles Dempsey stood on the bridge of HMS Bulolo, watching the English coast fade into blackness behind him. As commander of the British Second Army, he bore responsibility for 3 of the 5 invasion beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword. His men would storm ashore at dawn, fight through German defenses built over 4 years, and establish a foothold that must not fail. Ahead lay the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, Rommel's masterpiece of defensive engineering. Behind lay everything they were fighting for. Dempsey had spent months studying those defenses. He knew the positions of every machine gun, every artillery piece, every minefield. Intelligence reports painted a detailed picture. The German 716th Infantry Division held the coastline, a static unit of older soldiers and conscripted Eastern Europeans. But the 21st Panzer Division lurked inland near Caen, ready to counterattack. If those tanks reached the beaches before the Allies established anti-tank positions, the invasion would collapse into slaughter. The naval bombardment would begin at 5:30 a.m. 6 battleships, 23 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers would unleash the greatest naval barrage in history. But Dempsey knew bombardments rarely destroyed deeply dug defenders. The bunkers would survive. His men would face German steel. Across the channel, the airborne assault had already begun. British pathfinders from the 22nd Independent Parachute Company jumped first, marking drop zones with electronic beacons and lights. Behind them came the main force of the 6th Airborne Division, tasked with capturing 2 crucial bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal. Those bridges were the gateway to Sword Beach's eastern flank. If the Germans destroyed them, Rommel's panzers could roll up the invasion from the side. Major John Howard led the glider assault on Pegasus Bridge. His men of D Company, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, crash-landed within 50 yards of their objective at 12:16 a.m., the first Allied soldiers to touch French soil on D-Day. Within 10 minutes, they had seized the bridge intact. The German garrison, caught completely by surprise, barely managed to fire a shot. The first victory of the invasion lasted less than a quarter hour. But it proved something essential: the Germans were not ready. In France, the resistance ignited. BBC Radio had broadcast the coded message earlier that evening, verses from a poem by Verlaine signaling the invasion was imminent. Railway workers sabotaged track switches. Telephone lines went dead across Normandy. German commanders found themselves blind and confused, unable to communicate with higher headquarters or coordinate their response. Rommel remained in Germany, still unaware that the storm had passed. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, hesitated to wake him with incomplete reports. By the time accurate information reached Berlin, it would be too late to matter. back on HMS Bulolo, Dempsey retreated to his cabin. He opened a letter from his wife, written weeks ago and saved for this moment. She wrote about their garden in England. Spring flowers blooming. The ordinary beauty of a world untouched by war. He read her words twice, then folded the paper carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. Against his heart, somewhere out there, young men were dying. Paratroopers landing in flooded fields. Glider pilots crashing into Norman hedgerows. Resistance fighters executed by German patrols. The cost of liberation was already being paid in blood. Dempsey checked his watch. 4 hours until H hour. 4 hours until the landing craft hit the beaches. 4 hours until he learned whether Churchill's generals had planned victory or catastrophe. The fleet sailed on through the darkness, engines thrumming, bows cutting through the diminishing waves. 5,000 ships carrying the hopes of the free world. Above them, the clouds continued to part. Stars emerged. The moon cast silver light on the water. On the horizon, the French coast appeared as a thin black line. Flashes of anti-aircraft fire erupted from the shore. The enemy had finally noticed. The first shells from HMS Warspite screamed over Sword Beach at 5:30 a.m., announcing the liberation of Europe in thunder and fire. The old battleship, a veteran of Jutland in the First World War, poured 15-inch rounds into German positions with mechanical fury. 23 cruisers and 100 destroyers joined the chorus. The Norman coastline disappeared behind curtains of smoke and flame. General Montgomery received the reports at his mobile headquarters near Portsmouth. The naval bombardment was proceeding as planned. The airborne forces had secured their objectives, Pegasus Bridge held, the Merville Battery silenced, the flooding zones along the Dives River blocked. German communications remained in chaos. Rommel had not yet returned from Germany, but the beaches themselves remained a question mark. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave of landing craft hit Sword Beach. Royal Marine Commandos and infantry from the 3rd Division charged through waist-deep water toward a wall of machine gun fire. The bombardment had suppressed some German positions but not all. Concrete bunkers that had survived the shelling roared back to life. Men fell in the surf. Others reached the seawall and pressed themselves against the sand, gasping for breath, waiting for engineers to blow gaps in the obstacles. General Miles Dempsey landed at midday. He walked through scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Destroyed tanks smoldered on the sand. Medics worked frantically on wounded soldiers, their hands red to the wrists. Bodies lay in rows, covered by blankets or simply left where they fell. The smell of cordite and blood filled the air, but his men were advancing. The 3rd Division had pushed inland, linking up with the paratroopers at Pegasus Bridge exactly as planned. The German 716th Infantry Division was collapsing. Prisoners streamed toward the beach with their hands raised. Further west, the Americans faced horror. Omaha Beach had become a killing ground. Preliminary bombing had missed the defenses entirely. 32 amphibious tanks meant to support the infantry had sunk in the rough seas. Men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions died by the hundreds in the first hour, pinned against the seawall by interlocking fields of fire. For terrible minutes, it seemed the assault might fail completely. Montgomery received the reports with grim composure. He could not reinforce Omaha, the American sector belonged to General Omar Bradley. But he could accelerate the British advance, threatening German reserves before they could be redirected. He ordered the 50th Division at Gold Beach and the Canadian 3rd Division at Juno Beach to push harder inland. The German response came at 4 in the afternoon. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to counterattack, struck the gap between Sword and Juno beaches. 50 tanks rumbled toward the sea. If they broke through, they could roll up the invasion from the flank. British anti-tank gunners met them with 6-pounder guns and PIAT launchers. RAF Typhoons screamed overhead, firing rockets into the panzer columns. The fighting was desperate, close range, brutal. German tanks burned. British positions were overrun and recaptured. The line bent but did not break. By nightfall, the counterattack had failed. The 21st Panzer Division retreated inland, having lost half its strength. Dempsey stood on a bluff overlooking Sword Beach as the sun set. Behind him, the dead lay waiting for burial. Ahead, his tanks pushed toward Cannes. The Atlantic Wall was broken. The Allies had landed 132,000 men on French soil. The cost was heavy, over 10,000 casualties, including more than 4,000 dead, but the foothold was secured. A young officer approached with a message from Montgomery. The Second Army had met its objectives. The link-up with airborne forces was complete. The road to Cannes lay open, though the city itself would take weeks more to capture. Dempsey read the message and nodded slowly. He did not smile. He was thinking of the men who had not survived this day. The paratroopers drowned in flooded fields. The tank crews who burned alive in their vehicles. The infantrymen who never made it past the waterline. They had paid for this moment. Every yard of French soil had cost blood. That evening, Winston Churchill addressed Parliament. His voice carried across the radio to a waiting world. The first of a series of landings has been successfully effected. The fire of the shore batteries has been largely quelled. The landings proceed at various points at the present time. In Normandy, Montgomery studied his maps by lamplight. The first day was won. But Rommel was finally returning from Germany. German reserves were mobilizing across France. The battle for Normandy would rage for 2 more months before Paris fell. The generals had planned well. The soldiers had fought bravely. And history had turned. The liberation of Europe had begun.